Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another episode of DigiPod on DawnNews English. I'm your host, Usama Khilji. Today, we're going to be talking about the human costs of generative AI or artificial intelligence. And this is our discussion is going to be based on a new report that's out by Amnesty International. And hence, we're lucky to be joined by Hajira Maryam, who's the lead advisor at Amnesty International's Algorithmic Accountability Lab. So thank you very much for joining us, Hajra. And we're essentially going to be exploring whether the problem with generative AI misuse is harm built into many of the systems that we see with artificial intelligence. Is it the way they're designed, or is there something else? Is it the use that's problematic? Because a lot of times we hear, oh, platforms are neutral, right? And it depends on how you use it. But maybe there are some other aspects of it that people are not paying attention to. And that's what this report essentially explores. So to start with, Hadra, maybe you can tell us a bit about the hidden supply chain behind artificial intelligence. So is generative AI just a chatbot or an image tool, or is there more to it than we usually think of?
Thank you so much and welcome, Salam Usama, for having me in this podcast. So, just a few weeks ago, Amnesty International published a research briefing on the human cost, like rights cost of generative AI, titled "Unlawful by Design." And I want to emphasize like the first point that you just raised, right? Like the concept of neutrality when technology is talked about, and a lot of the times, like even government officials right now and even industry behemoths, they do market these technologies as being something like an efficient solution in society. And, that comes with neutrality. But technology can never be really neutral. It is politicized, it is ideological, and it is always deployed in a certain context. So kind of like thinking about that, like, technology from that framework, even in regards to generative AI, is really important. Now, when we speak about the briefing itself, we focus on how the generative AI industry as a whole is extractive by design. And by design, it leads to like a mass invasion of privacy and of our human rights. By design is a very important concept that we weave into the briefing itself, which and our analysis are based on the framework of international human rights law. So when we talk about the supply chain element, we talk about how like there are various actors that are involved from the development, training, and deployment chain of the generative AI system, and how all of these contributes to massive human rights abuses and violations, right? We can start from the web scraping element of generative AI system, where a lot of your data is collected non-consensually, and how that data is trained and then deployed, and the consequences of that deployment that do carry like really serious human rights costs. It can be our environment, on the labor, on our privacy. So these are some elements that we focus on.
Absolutely. No, thank you for really explaining that, is in such a clear manner, because the evolution of AI has really outpaced its understanding, and I feel like that's true when it comes to governments, when it comes to users, and a lot of people in Silicon Valley say that even Silicon Valley is not really understanding what they're doing, right? Because every day we're hearing new things. Um, so it would be interesting to hear from you. Why did Amnesty look at this, at AI through a supply chain lens in particular?
So we looked into a supply chain lens because, as I said, like there are multiple pillars that we looked into. First of all, there is of course like the entire data element, right? That comes with like how this data is really collected, and then trained, and then at the same time, the environmental costs that we are seeing right now in terms of data centers, the non-consent consensual type of like extractive data practices that are taking place without the users themselves knowing or consenting to data collection practices. Think about, the amount of information just exists about you and me on the internet, right? Our images, our likes and dislikes on social media, so on and so forth. So that is like one of the reasons, of course, we focused on the supply chain element. And then of course there are design choices, and these design choices, we argue, are not inevitable, as they are prescribed to be by tech giants, so on and so forth. And then speaking about, like, how our rights to privacy are also impacted because of these design choices. So we conducted, we need to think about international human rights law framework, right? An international human rights law framework, there are some proportionality tests that are carried out in terms of analyzing if something is proportionate or not. And we looked into how, like, the amount of data that is actually collected is really disproportionate. And hence we argue that the design choices behind this extractive industry is quite problematic. And it happens throughout the trail of the supply chain itself. And of course, like, throughout the years, we are also seeing there's this entire phenomena of AI hype that is taking place, right? The way these technologies are sold, like, to us, to our psyche, but also to governments. And with this hype phenomena, there is like an entire mass scale type of expansion of AI industry taking place as a whole, in terms of like data centers that are being developed in a lot of, like, implemented in a lot of global majority countries, so on and so forth, that are having like adverse consequences for the environment, for the local communities that are in those jurisdictions, in terms of our water and access to water supply, and so on and so forth. So we always need to think about like a trail of like how this technology is really developed from the development, training, and deployment phase overall, and how those carry human rights consequences.
Right. And you've told us how the mass web scraping is central to a lot of these AI tools that are standalone that a lot of people are now using, right? Um, in your view, or dependent, like, looking at your research, should publicly available data be treated as free training material for AI systems?
That's a really good question, Usama. So I will first of all go on in terms of defining what exactly we mean when Amnesty International defines as standalone generative AI systems, right? In other words, basically, it's a generative AI models that come with their own front end for direct use that is fundamentally concerned with generating outputs. And basically, all these, like, standalone generative AI systems, we analyze systems by Meta's, for instance, Meta's Llama, Google's Gemini, OpenAI's, then Midjourney, DeepSeek, so on and so forth. And all these systems, they rely on unlawful web scraping. And this is in conflict with international human rights law, given like the mass amounts of data that are fed into these systems without a consent that is being used to train them, and hence the making the system in use. And then, of course, this type of like data collection and training of models it abuses rights to privacy, because they also enable discrimination, and they also threaten our freedom of thought and expression.
Right. And you've spoken about consent, and I want to unpack that a little bit, because consent to giving up your data, which includes your identity, right? And we know how already with surveillance capitalism, a lot of the tech platforms already have us profiled down to the core, right? So much so that people think, oh, our phones are listening to us. So even if they're not listening to us, they know everything about us, and they can tell uh, oftentimes what we want or what we desire, right? And that's how the ad ecosystem works in social media companies, for example. What could an alternative look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, in terms of alternatives, of course, there is this entire marketing in terms of large language models as if they are the only go-to solution, for us to reach like this efficient state and this efficient type of like civilization, so to speak, right? That's how a lot of technological like leaps do happen across like history. That's quite normal in terms of like discourse and narratives. As well. And I do think like in a lot of the times the media itself, like it needs to really unpack on how to report on these type of like systems, and how to critically report on these type of like technologies that are promoted by Sam Altman's or I know Zuckerbergs of the world, but of course, like while large language model based generative AI tools have been particularly like really popular since the launch of ChatGPT back in November 2022. There are many other types and scales of generative AI technologies and techniques, many of which do not rely on unlawful web scraping or mass invasions of privacy by design. These are, of course, like small language models that we're talking about, right? So these small language models are often smaller in scope and in size in terms of both training data and parameters. And then this means that basically small language models are based on generative AI systems are often highly very domain specific and specialized, whereas LLMs can often veer into misleading or appearing to have wide-ranging expertise, so on and so forth. And small language models are consequently also like really less like resource intensive. They're more accurate
Mhm.
based on often local and very like industry specific training data and less prone to the problems that are associated with large language models.
I want to go a bit into the discrimination aspect that you touched upon, under the umbrella of the rights that are violated in AI systems. And maybe we can talk a bit about how training data itself can reproduce racial, gender, cultural, and linguistic biases that exist in general. And so maybe you can talk a bit about that.
Yeah, thanks, Osama. I think that's one of the biggest arguments that do come out, right? Like how, the outputs that are generated by these Gen AI systems are really problematic because they come with bias and so on and so forth. So, of course, this is one of the claims that we also unpack in our briefing. And we do say that they do demonstrate systematic biases and discriminate against marginalized groups. Because think about it this way, right? As the industry is expanding and as the data sets powering these generative AI tools scale up, so do systematic biases because there is already a presence of hateful and discriminatory content on the internet. They also scale up along with scaling up of these data sets, and then this leads to rise in outputs that demonstrate stereotypes and prejudices, especially along racial and gendered lines.
Absolutely. So it's essentially a reflection of the power disbalance that pre-exists on the internet and is essentially being perpetuated at scale, right? Through large language models. Um, you spoke a bit about the different biases. Maybe we can touch a bit on the English heavy data sets that exist and how that matters for global majority countries, right? Like Pakistan, or for example, Senegal, or for Argentina, or other countries where English is not the main language that's spoken or used.
Yeah, definitely. The entire Anglo influence and Westernized influence is quite dominant in these like massive like generative AI models. And this happens like basically a lot. The problem also arises a lot in terms of like content moderation and risk
Mm.
associated with content moderation. So of course, like since a lot of the training data is in English, generative AI models tend to skew and reinforce more Western standards and Anglophone linguistic and cultural dominances. And then basically you can say because of this and because of this pre-existing data, that is more English and Western, the technology doesn't really account for any local nuances or cultural or linguistic concerns of the global majority country. Therefore, whenever it is used in content moderation, for example, large language model based generative AI tools, they kind of risk flagging, removing, or completely suppressing content that is, in global majority languages or different contexts without any justification. There's also, of course, like a lot of politicization that comes ingrained with these generative AI models. For instance, if you look into DeepSeek, right? When you put a prompt in DeepSeek about the Tiananmen Square massacre that happened in 1989, the prompt really doesn't work. It says, oh, let's just talk about something else. So there could be like some sort of politicization too that as well that is embedded into these systems. That is a big concern.
Yes, and what you're describing is essentially censorship, because you have all these biases within the companies or the countries where the companies are based, and hence they perpetuate those political policies of government. So, for example, we've seen how US-based platforms also have to follow US sanctions lists, right? So based on that, any group that the United States government will sanction will face censorship on social media, owned by America-based companies. And at the same time, you've told us about the Chinese example where Chinese political biases or Chinese political policy would be reflected in the systems that are based there. What does that mean for the rest of the world, right? Because you have just one or two countries or a few handful of countries not only exercising that economic power of AI systems, but then also the political and linguistic power that they have, right? And then what we have in the rest of the world is basically becoming passive consumers that are subjected to that level of political censorship where there's so much that you can't talk about. And we've seen that play out in the past 3 years with the Israeli genocide. And, there were examples of such models not even saying that, oh, Israel's committing genocide because the way it had been trained. So how does that play out in terms of censorship, not only in the host countries of these companies, but for the rest of us all over the world?
It is a very, very good question. I would definitely say that. And also kind of like just the Algorithmic Accountability Lab where I do work in Amnesty. We actually were established before the AI hype, before ChatGPT came into the picture, right? And I still remember having conversations with my colleagues where I was like, oh, how will we really talk about AI, and so on and so forth. And now look at us, like 3.5 years down the line, the world is so different. But yeah, I think in terms of like censorship, a major rising concern that is, of course, that we do witness is like how there is across the world, there is the rise in authoritarian practices, right? When you think about Trump's presidency and, the entire tech behemoths and oligarchs, you need to think about his inauguration picture. So, Sam, as I was saying, if you think about like Trump's presidency, right, he was surrounded by these tech oligarchs. And of course, like with that, we are also seeing how rising authoritarianism today is quite in alignment with like how what these technology companies really want across the world. So there is this entire shift in how authoritarianism and authoritarian powers and practices are also going hand in hand in terms of like the deployment and the use of these technologies. So of course, in terms of censorship, like this is like a very big concern, because the more these tech giants, behemoths, and the kind of ideologies they perpetuate across the world, the more their systems and technologies are validated, right? When you also look in the type of reporting, for instance, that might be done in Pakistan on AI, every other day there might be a headline saying, oh, there's going to be this data center that is going to be deployed, and that is going to be constructed in the country, but nobody's really talking about like the kind of consequences that these data centers are going to have in the society itself, have given how Pakistan is one of the countries that is like really high in terms of like climate risk, in terms of water shortages and so on and so forth. So it's just, of course, like censorship is there, but I think it's also important, like the multifaceted view and the effects, like, these type of technological developments are carried forward in any part of the world, in the global majority. For example, the type of narratives that are perpetuated, the types of understanding, which is like a very misled understanding that is absorbed by the people, normalizing the use of such systems.
Absolutely. And I think, your report sort of addresses this quite well. Maybe we can now come to regulation, right? So we're seeing, the European Union passed the EU AI Act. There's a lot of countries working on these. Some countries have come up with AI policies. Pakistan has one as of last year. Maybe we can get to, in terms of regulation in this report, Amnesty is calling for prohibition of systems that are built on unlawful web scraping, right? In terms of regulation, how does Amnesty envision that playing out? What's the role of the state in all of this?
Yeah, definitely. You mentioned the EU's AI Act, so just to talk a bit about it as well, how states can actually act. EU's AI Act, there was a lot of industry lobbying as well that took place that watered down regulation in terms of like a human rights framework too, right? And this is what's been happening across the world. If you recently, the president of Argentina, Javier Milei, he published a opinion piece in the Financial Times, where he is completely dismissing regulation and talking about like how, oh, we need to attract technology, we need to attract AI in order to like really enhance kind of like the capitalistic cycle in terms of like moving the society forward. So states are they play like a really really big role. I think states need to look at like whenever they are looking into regulating these technologies. First of all, they have to be centric to international human rights law framework. That is like very very fundamental. We need to look at like how are these technologies harming communities. States need to like really talk with the impacted communities, who are going to feel the first-hand harms of these technologies, to consult them and really try to understand like how to really build regulatory framework. States really need to talk to human rights experts about these technologies. What states are sometimes usually doing is like they rely on the industry as the expert. But not in none of the cases we have seen where people who are actually impacted or are facing the first-hand harm of these technologies are being consulted. Human rights groups are not consulted, so on and so forth. So it is really important that states establish clear accountability mechanisms for AI-related harms and carry important human rights impact assessment, so on and so forth.
And that's interesting because, the United States traditionally, and especially in the Trump presidency, has been completely against state intervention when it comes to AI and tech companies. But we recently saw where the U.S. government banned and did export controls on Anthropic from allowing any non-American, non-U.S. citizens using, I think it's Mythos, that Claude has, sorry, that Anthropic had launched. So that shows that there are lines for even the most hands-free governments when it comes to tech regulation like the US, where they realize that no, the government has to step in and stop it for whatever reason there may be, right? And like you mentioned, that human rights oftentimes is not part of that framework that we're seeing, at least in the big giants like the United States, where a lot of the AI research and development is taking place, right? So let's see how the future course is when it comes to AI regulation. We've also seen, there's this tension and there's this difference between banning harmful design of AI systems and then banning AI altogether. Where do you see like the difference between these two actions?
Yeah, that's a question we are asked a lot. I think sometimes you're seen as like anti-AI in the type of like, through that framework, which is actually quite false. If you look at all the reports that we have published in terms of, human rights risk associated with AI, be it in the public sector, be it in the military domain, weapons industry, be it in policing, be it like something like generative AI, we always look at like international human rights law as the core pillar of driving our analysis and investigations forward. So this is what I would like to say. Like it is important that like companies who are also developing these AI systems, they need to conduct like comprehensive human rights due diligence throughout the development and deployment life cycle of generative AI systems, and they need to publicly report on any risks that are identified and the risk mitigation measures that are taken to address those risks. So in order risks should be identified in the development stage of the product itself, and the human rights abuses and other harms which are identified, they must be stopped once the technologies have been launched. So there's like always like these due diligence processes that companies can conduct and do to mitigate like the harms that are associated or perpetuated because of these technologies. And then other thing I would really like to emphasize is like consulting like local communities, activists, affected communities, especially in relation to the design and development of lawful AI models and impacts is also equally important, particularly those communities which have been historically marginalized or discriminated against. Another thing I would also like to emphasize, you mentioned exports, right? Sometimes there is, of course, like a massive double standard that we do see in the regulatory space as well. For instance, in the EU's AI Act, exporting harmful systems was not banned in the regulatory framework. So it is important that states need to also like double down on these lessen these double standards and really think about like globally about the problem as a whole. So these are some of the pointers I think which are quite important in the discussion.
Right. And what you're alluding to is the military use of AI, right? So the EU AI Act excludes military use of AI from the jurisdiction of the act. And of course, we've seen the role AI has played in warfare, right? And how detrimental it has been in the military actions of Israel in Palestine. We've seen it being used in Iran also by the US and Israel. And then it's a reality. And I think it predates even, what we're hearing about now, like drone strikes that were taking place over Pakistan as far back as 2007, 2008, or even before, were using signature strikes where technological systems based in the US through surveillance drones were looking at militant age males that could be legitimate targets in the tribal areas of Pakistan, and that's why we saw such a large civilian death toll. So there's a very immediate real world harm that we're talking about in these cases. And then when you talked about regulation and export control, we have the United Nations Business and Human Rights Guiding Principles that put responsibility not only on companies, but also on governments. And that's where if there's technology by companies being exported that may be harmful to human rights, then the host government also has a responsibility to stop those exports. And I think those conversations really, really need to pick up. And then we have a lot of different pre-existing initiatives related to business and human rights, right? So I think the inclusion of AI companies in those mechanisms is also key, whereas we've been seeing that they're being shielded. Hadra, so we've talked about, accountability a little bit, but I would like to ask you next is who should be accountable when harm is produced through artificial intelligence systems? And, a lot of times this is across multiple actors. So what could accountability look like?
So, as I said, states do have like a very big role to play in terms of like really, in terms of prohibiting these type of human rights violating systems that are produced by the companies. So, in that sense, like companies like they should be held accountable by the states as well to prohibit these technologies, so on and so forth. And legal measures and regulatory frameworks must be implemented, to ensure that such, rights abusing technologies are not deployed and implemented in the first place. But as I've also said, with the rising authoritarianism right now around the world, across the world right now, there's also like a deregulatory push and agenda that is actually taking place through the omnibus proposals in the EU. Not sure if that is informed right now, but in the across, like especially since the Trump's presidency, there's this entire deregulatory push that is also happening across the world, which is actually calling for going backwards in regulation in terms of regarding these technologies, so on and so forth. So of course, states do have like a lot of responsibility on them in terms to regulate and prohibit these technologies that are developed by these companies for lucrative purposes, for profit making purposes. There is this entire type of discourse that is played out that, oh, AI is like a force of good, and going to nourish the society and make the society efficient, and all that la la land that we kind of think about. But in reality, that's really not the case. These technologies, as I've mentioned in the beginning of the interview as well, they are not neutral. Technology is introduced in a certain context, that amplifies pre-existing discrimination and biases.
Absolutely. So in the end, and I know we've touched upon this, but just to, circle back on through our conversation, what would you say states, companies, and global institutions should be doing next?
Oh, yeah, that's a big question. I think it's important that robust regulatory frameworks to govern AI development deployment are implemented. Mandatory human rights impacts assessments are made, by these actors. Clear accountability mechanisms for AI related harms are also introduced, and of course, we need to really think about our protection of privacy and our data, right? Your data should not be there for free to be used by these companies for them to make billions and billions of profit. So how is your data really protected? In terms of generative AI as well, there have been some governments that have introduced like concerns regarding these technologies, like the Italian Data Protection Authority, the Polish authorities as well. So there is like some type, a little bit of galvanization by states and authorities as well, that are raising concerns about these technologies and the way they do misuse users' data, or like take all that data without any consent. So this type of like collective mobilization by states is like really important to hold these companies to account, to really question what kind of systems they're really putting out there for us to normalize and to use. Across the world right now, we are seeing this normalization of using AI because it is becoming so widespread, right? But then also for us, like to critically think, like, is this really beneficial for us or not? Beyond generative AI, artificial intelligence systems are used in policing systems, in facial recognition technology. It is used in the public sector to decide, if someone deserves access to food, medicine, welfare, so on and so forth. And there's a rewriting of like the social contract as a whole.
Mm.
As someone who is living in a certain society, like what does your existence really mean? It's completely being embedded with these systems that are deciding for you rather than you having any free will or any rights.
Absolutely. And lastly, I want to talk a bit about global institutions. So we've seen, the UN Secretary General had a high-level advisory board on AI that came up with a few guiding principles. We've also seen, different UN bodies, the Global Digital Compact. Then I think there's the AI Summit taking place every year. There's more meetings happening in Geneva next month. Um, how do you see them enforcing a lot of what discussions are happening? Is it even possible, or what should the ideal scenario or role of these global institutions really be?
Yeah, they have a very, very big role to play, in my opinion, in terms of like really questioning the private industry actors that are, normalizing these technologies with the states, so on and so forth. You mentioned the summits, right? I think they're become like such an interesting, not interesting. So they're very problematic actually. Thinking about the back from the UK summit that took place where Rishi Sunak was talking with Elon Musk. And then, we had the summit in India where, all these tech giants were raising hands with Narendra Modi. And then, of course, there was the French summit as well. In each and every summit, it is always like the industry that is pushed forward, right? And that's very concerning because then who is really defining the trajectory of what these technologies should be in our lives. And I think these summits are like a spectacle ground to kind of reinforce that idea that the expertise lies within the industry only. Expertise lies within these software engineers. So it's like a very interesting space in our opinion. But yeah, there's like a big, massive responsibility, when it comes to like these global institutions as well that they need to play. But who are they really, seeking expertise from? Who are they really trying to consult from? How much space are people who are impacted because of these technologies, or human rights bodies are having, kind of like collaborating on this all together? I think these are some important steps that need to be kept in mind.
Absolutely, right? There needs to be multi-stakeholderism where, like you said, the rights holders, the impacted communities, civil society, human rights groups, and I think academia, education sector, right? Health sector, public sector, all needs to be involved in these conversations and equal footing. Because otherwise you're just pushing the companies to profit more and the states are just, trying to benefit from that, but they're not thinking a lot about the harms. So thank you very much for joining us, Hadra, for this very, very interesting and enlightening conversation. We've discussed, the human rights cost of generative AI. We've touched topics like sustainability and environment and the climate change impacts, but also how these systems are built, whose data are they really looking at, what rights are being violated, and throughout this process, the discrimination that's involved. But we've also looked at alternatives, right? So we've discussed how what an ideal scenario would look like, and what kind of regulation there needs to be, and who needs to be at the table. So hopefully, civil society, the human rights movement, but also overall society in general will be able to catch up with the speed of these AI companies in trying to ensure that there's some semblance of balance, there's some semblance of protection from harm, and justice and fairness within these systems. So that's it from us today. We'll be back with another episode next week. This is your host, Usama Khilji, signing out. Thank you.